The UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and heads of commission of the permanent 5 countries discuss peace in Yemen. The U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen, Linda King, meets with the government officials in Riyadh. The joint forces deter Houthi rebels' attacks in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Rana Swaidam. UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg met with the heads of the mission of the permanent 5 countries and the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Linderking, in Riyadh today. After the meeting, a statement was released from countries of France, Russia, China, UK and USA in support of the UN envoy efforts to end the conflict in Yemen. The statement called on all parties to directly engage with the UN envoy without preconditions, as the Yemeni people need a genuine commitment to have peace. Previously, the UN Special Envoy met with the Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. The President confirmed the government will provide full support to the new UN envoy and will also facilitate his mission in order to bring about a comprehensive ceasefire in the country. Grunberg, however, stressed to work on finding the best way to move forward in the peace process and that he and his team will work in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions, adhering to the 3 agreements to move towards achieving peace that the Yemeni people deserve. Meanwhile, the U.S. envoy Tim Linderking met with the President Hadi to discuss peace efforts. During the meeting, Linderking affirmed that the international community stands united towards Yemen. In the meantime, he also warned that Iran's behavior represents a threat to the peace process. The United Nations group of eminent experts in Yemen issued their 4th report before Human Rights Council last Wednesday. More on the major findings and the controversy of the UN Committee's report can be found here.
There's been no let-up in more than 6 years of conflict in Yemen, as a growing climate of fear among civilians continues. A panel of the UN-appointed independent rights experts said on Wednesday. In a new report commissioned by the Human Rights Council into how the war has been waged over the last 20 months, the panel condemned the same egregious violations that have characterized their previous findings. These include indiscriminate shelling of civilians, particularly by Houthi rebels, and also by the government. The report stressed that all parties to the conflict were responsible for violations, many of which may amount to international crimes. Examples include humanitarian restrictions and obstacles to access to food and healthcare, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, gender-based violence, including sexual violence, torture, and the forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, denial of fair trial rights, violations of fundamental freedoms, prosecution and violations against journalists, human rights defenders, minorities, migrants, and internationally displaced persons, and violations of children's rights. The report also highlights how intense hostilities have been on the Maghreb front in the past 12 months and in many other locations. The climate of fear, lawlessness, and impunity for all those living in Yemen has worsened further despite political agreements and high-level discussions between key factors, said Kamil Jandoubi, the chairperson of the group of eminent experts. The UN-appointed panel of independent experts warned that every day in life in Yemen is now unbearable for many, as in addition to the conflict, people have to contend with disease outbreaks, the COVID-19 pandemic, flooding, import restrictions, and economic and fuel crises, and limited humanitarian aid. In the midst of the current intolerable situation, only genuine political will on the part of the parties to the conflict and their backers, but also on the part of the international community, can end Yemen's suffering, Mr. Jandoubi said. The group of eminent experts urge a full cessation of hostilities and an end to supply arms to Yemen by third parties. The experts also stress they must be held accountable for violations committed. The report highlights steps that can be taken, including making the peace process more inclusive and encouraging a commitment to accountability in peace talks. Space needs to be created for discussions on transitional justice, prioritizing consultations with victims, and putting in place initiatives to strengthen the capacity of Yemeni civil society. It is now clear that no peace, let alone a sustainable and inclusive one, can be achieved in the absence of political will and a strong commitment for accountability, Mr. Jandoubi added. The experts reiterated that the Security Council should integrate the human rights dimensions of the conflict in Yemen more fully into its agenda and ensure that there is no impunity for the most serious crimes. To conclude, the collective efforts and dedication shown by the international community towards Yemen is appreciated, but the central question in the minds of millions of common Yemenis, which is why all those efforts haven't been able to end their suffering so far.
In Riyadh, a quartet statement issued on behalf of the United States, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, stressing the importance of implementing the Riyadh Agreement. The statement indicated the need for the government to return to Aden, noting its effective role in overseeing future international support for economic recovery and its commitment to a comprehensive political solution to the conflict in Yemen, while affirming full support for the United Nations Special Envoy. The quartet's statement expressed its concern about the devaluation of the rial and the rise in food prices and the impact of that on the Yemeni economy and the current humanitarian situation. The United Nations announced that it has received 54% of humanitarian funding in Yemen for the year 2021. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Yemen indicated that the humanitarian response plan in Yemen has received 54% of the requested funding. The office added that many sectors are severely underfunded, noting that only 15% out of the total donations was received, which is less than the required funding. This in turn can affect flow provision of humanitarian aids. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate has repeatedly condemned parties of the conflict unfair practices against journalists and freedom of speech. Journalists have been unfairly sentenced to death, subjected to assault, torture and detention in solitary confinement. The following report sheds light on the human rights violations committed against journalists in Yemen during war.
Although Houthi militia has closed all opposition and independent newspapers and foreign media offices in areas under its control, the militia is on top of the lists of press freedoms violators in Yemen. The militia continue arresting journalists, 4 of whom have been sentenced to death. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate released a report in the first half of 2021 over press freedom violations that affected all media employees, correspondents, media institutions, and journalists' properties. In its latest report, the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate recorded 112 cases of violations. These violations varied between kidnapping, detention, threats, incitement, stalking and prevention of coverage, confiscation of newspapers and accountability of journalists. According to the report, the Houthi militia committed 20 cases of violations, the government 10 cases, while the Southern Transitional Council committed 6 cases of violations against press freedom. However, 9 journalists are still detained by the Houthi militia: Wahid al-Sufi, Abdul Khaliq Umran, توفيق المنصوري, أكرم الوليدي, حارث حامد, نبيل السدوي, Muhammad al-Salahi, Walid al-Matari and Muhammad Ali al-Junaid, 4 of whom have been unfairly sentenced to death. Likewise, journalist Muhammad Qaid al-Maqri has been kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in Hadramaut since 2015. The International Federation of Journalists condemned the ongoing violence against Yemeni journalists and called to end impunity culture. The Federation announced its support for the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate that requested an immediate release of all media employees and called on the warring parties to respect press freedom. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate stated that journalists and media violations have increased significantly, especially against those who oppose their rule. Media freedom in Yemen has been subjected to more than 1,400 violations since the beginning of the war, including 38 killings of journalists, photographers and other media employees. Since 2015, Yemen has become one of the most dangerous areas for journalist safety, especially with impunity that led to a scarcity of news coverage of the Yemeni crisis. Meanwhile, the Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists, Anthony Belangi, said, "The Federation and the Journalist Syndicate condemn this ongoing violence against media in Yemen. All kidnapped journalists must be released and death sentences must be quashed immediately. We urge the authorities to take urgent actions to ensure the safety of journalists and end impunity for crimes committed against journalists and media workers," Pelangi added. Journalists suffer no less than the rest of those affected by the war, as they make great efforts and go under life risks to convey the suffering of the Yemeni people despite the violations they receive, especially from the Houthi militia.
In Hodeidah, joint forces thwarted a Houthi attack in Al-Jah, south of the city. Military sources stated that the joint forces have clashed with the Houthi militia, stressing that the militia rebels were inflicted with heavy losses in personnel and equipment. Meanwhile, in Al-Durayhimi, Houthi militia killed a citizen with artillery shelling. Local sources reported that Alawi Ahmad Darwish, 18 years old, was killed when a Houthi shell landed on residents' homes in Dakhnan area. Coming next. Angry rallies over hard living conditions continue in Aden and Hadramaut cities for the 6th consecutive day amid government failure to take proper actions.
أقول لك راحت بالغداء لأهلها شلت الغداء وراحت بالأهلها في المزرعة، والمزرعة ركبت على حمار ما حتى نص المزرعة وانفجر فيها اللغم، دعست على اللغم وانفجر فيهم. الحمار انتهى ما أدرها وتبقعت رجليها كامل. نغير منها نغير الشبعة للبيت سابها من دور رجليها، لما صافناها طبية أقرب طبية وصافناها لهي بطلت رجليها كامل.
قلت أزود هلي وقابل لي لعام. وطبعت تحت الزواية.
Welcome back. For the sixth consecutive day, rallies in southern cities continue over the economic collapse, especially with the national currency drop, constant power cuts, and unpaid salaries. This report has more details on the story.
Protests in the south of Yemen pose a new threat to the stability of the country. People affected by a host of daily troubles and took to the street to voice their grievance and anger. Protesters called on the government to act swiftly to solve their problems, especially returning electric power to the houses. People in Aden went out to the streets for 6 consecutive nights demanding provision of basic services. They cut off the main road, set fire on the tires, and clashed with security forces. The protests moved from Aden to other parts in the country, where Hadramaut and Lahj had protests too. Experts refer these protests to many reasons, including deteriorating life conditions, absence of basic services, collapse of the local currency, and the inability of the government to control or to steer life in an efficient way. As to the last point, governance is totally absent, according to experts, and corruption piles up the suffering of people. The Yemeni government does nothing to restrain the failing value of the rial against the US dollar. This drop in the value of the local currency affects to a greater extent other life conditions in the country. A tsunami of troubles seems to sweep every item and raises their cost. Yet, why this continuous fall of the rial is happening? Experts accuse some officials in the government of sharing with foreign exchange companies some profits for their monetary transactions. This claimed corruption adds to the complexity of the economic situation. Moreover, foreign exchange companies closed their doors by announcing a general strike in response to the economic collapse. These companies ironically condemn the government corruption and irresponsibility in dealing with the crisis, while they themselves are accused by experts of manipulating the foreign exchange rate and opening a black market to gain more profits in their transactions. The situation in Aden, Hadramaut and Lahj is alarming. The government must take a swift action to appease the people and curb the failing economic situation. Otherwise, the circle of protests may go out of control and the whole situation in Yemen will reach the point of no return.
Meanwhile, in Aden, the General Electricity Corporation announced the arrival of 5,000 metric tons of diesel as fuel supply for electricity. According to the corporation, this will cover 5 days until the arrival of the 4th batch of the Saudi Grant fuel on the 19th of this September. Truck drivers have announced a general strike in protest of the teasing practices and humiliating treatment that drivers encounter in checkpoints between Aden and Taiz. More on this story is within this report.
Heavy transport vehicles are lined up immobile, and the goal is to strike in protest against the extortion of drivers at the security points spread along the road linking the governorates of Aden and Taiz, and the royalties and detention that permeate this, and the matter may sometimes lead to arrest and murder. The strike continues, according to motorists, until the implementation of the demands on the table of the local authority and the leadership of Taiz military axis, which are the abolition of all illegal tax points and the raising of all receipts of improvement fees so that there is one improvement bond at the entrance to the governorate, securing the road from gangs, especially those who are covered in military uniform, protecting travelers and wayfarers from interruptions and looting, providing oil derivatives and selling them at official price, and replacing the current point members with qualified people who are good at dealing with others and prove that they follow the state of law and order. The strikers denounced the detention of some of their comrades to press them to end the strike, stressing that it is a right guaranteed by the Constitution and the law. Under their demands are met, and they will continue until the road is secured. The strike of motorists reflects the uncontrolled security situation along the road linking three governorates, Taiz, Lahj and Aden, which are places on the responsibility of the government emanating from the Riyadh Agreement to carry out its responsibilities in the security aspects and secure citizens, travelers so that the citizens feel safe, and to end the phenomena of deduction and fees for royalties and plunder.
In Taiz, two medical officials said that the city's two oxygen stations stopped working, causing death in isolation centers in the city. Taiz relies on the Al Thawra and Al Ta'awun stations to supply the city with oxygen tubes, but their interruption due to malfunctions and lack of fuel led to a major crisis in the isolation centers. Asil Al-Dahabi, the oxygen official at the isolation center in Taiz, said if the oxygen stations do not operate, patients may die inside the center due to lack of oxygen. On the other hand, Nashwan Al-Husami, head of the isolation center and director of the Republican Hospital, confirmed that there were deaths due to lack of oxygen in the city. The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 30 new cases of the COVID-19 in 5 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 14 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 10 in Ma'rib, 3 in Al-Bayda, 2 in Al-Mahra, and 1 in Shabwa. Also, 7 deaths were recorded, plus 20 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 8,557, including 1,619 deaths and 5,325 cases of recovery. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. The UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and heads of commission of the permanent 5 countries discuss peace in Yemen. The U.S. Special Envoy to Yemen, Linder King, meets with the government officials in Riyadh. The joint forces deter Houthi rebels' attacks in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. Thank you for watching. See you soon.